And then there were 15. Texas congressional hopeful Beto O'Rourke is the latest candidate to jump into the growing pool of Democratic hopefuls. O'Rourke joins seasoned players like Bernie Sanders and other first-timers like Kamala Harris. Will Beto be able to beat Bernie? Kenneth Vogel is a New York Times Washington correspondent, and he joins me now from Washington. Hey, Ken, great to see you. Thanks for your time. Tell us about...
Hey, Vashi, good to be with you.
Tell us about Mr. O'Rourke and what makes his entry into this significant.
Well, Beto O'Rourke was a darling of the left during his unsuccessful 2018 Senate campaign against Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas, who in many ways is a bête noire of the left. And the interesting thing about O'Rourke is he really tapped into this energy, this fire among the Democratic base by, in many ways running against as much President Trump as against Ted Cruz, raised a ton of money, a record-setting sum of money from small donors online, $80 million, more than ever been raised in any congressional race. Yet his positions in some ways were a little bit more to the center of the Democratic Party than where the base currently is. He has been mum on Medicare for All, which is a big sort of a rallying cry for the left. He has taken somewhat more centrist positions on various fiscal issues, yet he seems to nonetheless tap into this energy of the base, which in other ways is more to the left in a manner that some political prognosticators worry could end up producing a nominee for the Democratic Party to run against Trump who would be far to the left and who Donald Trump could brand as a socialist or someone who was out of step with sort of mainstream values in swing states. Beto O'Rourke could conceivably offer Democrats a promise of a candidate who really inspires the left, but also doesn't go too far to the left in such a way that would hinder the party in its effort to beat President Trump in 2020. Can
I ask you about the nature of that debate? Sort of, I consume a lot of American news, and there's a lot of discussion about the sort of AOC wing of the party as they talk about it. This idea that a candidate that's too far to the quote-unquote left will hand President Trump a win again. Can you give me some insight into what kinds of conversations are going on around where on the spectrum the Democratic candidate ends up?
Right. Well, I mean, you just pretty precisely characterize what many see as the far left end of that spectrum, and that is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the freshman Democratic congresswoman from New York, who has come in and robustly espoused very liberal values and a very liberal policy agenda that is, has allowed or has led to cries of socialism from the right and from President Trump. We're talking about her espousal of this Green New Deal to sort of reorient the U.S. economy around renewable energy, and had some planks in it that may have not been sort of fully sort of formed, that including the scaling back of air travel, and that the right has managed to characterize, perhaps mischaracterize, as eliminating air travel in an effort to reduce carbon emissions. So that's one end. And then at the other end, you have more centrist candidates like Joe Biden, or prospective candidates, I should say, the former vice president, who is seen as very much more centrist than where the party is currently, but nonetheless has potentially a base of support in winning these white working class voters in the upper Midwest and in Pennsylvania and some of these swing states that President Trump won and that carried him to the White House, and that Democrats see as necessary to winning back in order to defeat him in 2020, and worry that a more proudly or aggressively liberal candidate would not have as much of a chance as someone who could appeal to the middle.
Based on what you're seeing right now, do you think the question that Democratic voters are going to be thinking, or Democrats in general are going to be thinking of, is it going to be who do we pick that can most likely beat Trump, or is it going to be who do we pick who stands for what we collectively believe in?
Yeah,
or is that a binary choice?
In some ways, electability has long been something that has been coveted by operatives in both parties who have sort of sought out more centrist candidates. But that's not the calculus that primary voters use. Primary elections are base elections. They bring out the most fervent supporters of a political party who tend to be further to the extremes and who tend to embrace candidates who reflect those views. And so even if the strategist here in Washington may have some concerns about electing a candidate who is more to the left, a Bernie Sanders type, an Elizabeth Warren type, those arguments are sometimes lost on the voters who actually decide major party presidential nominations.
Okay, let me move on to a different subject because it's also dominating Capitol Hill today. The Senate voted to overturn President Trump's declaration of a national emergency at the U.S.-Mexico border. The move appears to have set the stage for President Trump to issue the first veto of his presidency. How do you read this?
I read it as another example of a rift where just enough Republicans are coming out against the president on key issues that have traditionally been aligned with the Republican orthodoxy but are not aligned in the Trump era with where the Republican Party is. In this case, the power of the executive. Enough Republicans are coming out to have at least a symbolic rebuke of the president. But of course, if he vetoes this resolution, as he has announced his intention to do, they don't have enough support. Republicans, there is not enough Republican support in the Senate as this vote, if things fall the way this vote does, to override that veto. In other words, 59 senators voted for this resolution. You would need 67 senators to override a veto. So it's probably going to go into effect, but it is important potentially because this vote and the arguments that Republican senators and Democratic senators made who supported this resolution could be used as fodder for some of these lawsuits that are going to challenge the constitutionality of this emergency declaration. It's not unreasonable to assume that the lawyers bringing these lawsuits would point to the U.S. Senate vote and say, look, even these members of President Trump's own party said that this was an unconstitutional overreach. That said, it now appears as if the emergency declaration is going to go into effect, and some of these lawsuits, while they may eventually yield some success or get some traction in the court, would be retroactively seeking to sort of put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Okay, one more topic for you before you get to leave. I want to ask you about some reporting that you did this week that I really read a lot about Boeing, and we've obviously been talking about that here. Our two countries were the last to essentially ground these airplanes, the MAX 8 and MAX 9s, the Boeing 737 jets. Tell us a bit about what you learned about Boeing's interactions with President Trump.
Yeah, Boeing made a really aggressive push to dissuade President Trump from supporting or calling for the grounding of these jets. Boeing's CEO had reached out several times in the run-up to President Trump's decision yesterday to ground the planes to urge him not to do so. They corresponded via email and then eventually talked on the phone, and the Boeing CEO reiterated the company's position that these planes are safe and urged President Trump to wait for the Federal Aviation Administration to do a comprehensive review to determine whether, in fact, it was some kind of aircraft error as opposed to pilot error that caused these two fatal crashes. Ultimately, President Trump ended up calling for the grounding of these planes, and we subsequently learned that he was, even as he was fielding these calls from Boeing, and even as he was seen to be dragging his feet on making the call to ground the planes, he had expressed some misgivings about these jets and said, according to my colleagues at the Washington Post, that the 737s, quote, suck. And expressed a preference for the 757s, which is the plane that he has, that he owns, that was Trump Force One that he campaigned on. You know, the president has really fancied himself something of an aviation expert. He, of course, owned an airline briefly in the 1980s that was financially disastrous. Actually had a crash, but not a fatal crash. And so he likes to weigh in on these types of decisions. We saw him weigh in on Twitter saying that the planes had become too complicated. I think that we're probably at the very early stages of this grounding. Just to give you some context, the last time that the FAA grounded a Boeing plane was in 2013. It was the Boeing 787, the Dreamliner so-called, and they grounded it for 3 months, and that was over a battery issue that didn't result in any crashes as far as we know, certainly didn't result in any fatalities. So we're at the very beginning stages of potentially far more serious review. that could have very vast economic implications for Boeing and for American air travel and air travel internationally, really. So not a decision to undertake based on a gut feeling about planes, and certainly the president suggested that he had had conversations with the FAA, and this wasn't just him, and his feeling about the 737s as to their airworthiness, making the call based on that, but rather would sort of defer to the FAA and their analysis.
All right, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time, but thanks for covering so much ground with us, Ken. That's Kenneth Vogel of the New York Times in Washington.